Gonna get us started. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the virtual launch of Understanding and Teaching the Holocaust, the most recent title in the Harvey Goldberg series for Understanding and Teaching History, published by the University of Wisconsin Press and edited by series editors John Tully, Matthew Mazer, and Brad Austin. My name is Avinoam Pat. I'm the Doris and Simon Conover Chair in Judaic Studies and Director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life at the University of Connecticut. Tonight's program is co-sponsored by the UConn Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life and the Maurice Greenberg Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Hartford. I'm going to share my screen so you can see the cover of our volume. Tonight's program is part one of this year's Virtual Holocaust Educators Workshop. Subsequent events will take place on October 26th, November 9th, and November 19th. I'd also like to thank Glenn Matoma and Nana Amos at the Thomas J. Dodd Research Center at the University of Connecticut for serving as our Zoom host tonight. As many of you know, this is especially fitting as Thomas J. Dodd was a prosecutor at Nuremberg, and his Nuremberg papers are indeed housed at the Dodd Center, where the Center for Judaic Studies is also located. You'll be hearing more in the next few months about exciting projects that the Center for Judaic Studies, the Dodd Center, at the Dodd Center and the Human Rights Institute are working on together to develop additional resources for teachers in the state of Connecticut working to fulfill the 2018 state mandate for Holocaust and genocide education. I want to welcome you tonight to what will be a very special program, one of those types of programs that we never would have imagined possible 6 months ago, but now all of a sudden quite possible. And one of the unique silver linings of this dreadful pandemic situation. We have just concluded the days of awe, the Yamim Noraim, marking the Jewish New Year and Yom Kippur. And so first I want to take a moment to wish everyone a happy and a healthy New Year. In a moment, I will introduce my amazing co-editor, Laura Hilton, who I first met at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, DC in 2005, when we participated in a summer research workshop together on Jewish displaced persons. I'm so grateful to Laura for inviting me to work together with her on this volume. She is a fantastic colleague, a gifted teacher and historian, and the best possible co-editor one can imagine. I'd also like to thank the series editors, the incredible editorial staff at the University of Wisconsin Press for their dedication to this series and their hard work to put together this timely and significant volume. Today is also a significant date, not only because we were able to gather so many of the volume's 20 contributors together, but it is an anniversary of sorts. As many of you likely know, on this date in 1941, on September 29th and 30th, 1941, 79 years ago, SS and German police units and their auxiliaries, under guidance of members of Einsatzgruppe C, murdered a large portion of the Jewish population of Kiev at Babi Yar, a ravine northwest of the city. According to the reports from that day, 33,771 Jews were massacred in this two-day period, making this one of the largest mass killings at an individual location during World War II. On this date, I should also note that in 1928, September 30th, 1928, Eliezer Wiesel was also born. So indeed, this is an appropriate date. Now, I'd like to just make a few comments on the format for tonight's program before I turn it over to Laura, as this is indeed a unique opportunity to hear from most of our phenomenal contributors in one place at the same time. We'll give everyone a chance to share a brief synopsis of their chapters as we proceed through the volume. We are truly fortunate to have such an incredible collection of contributors to this volume. Each author is an expert in their own field. I will serve as a facilitator and introduce each speaker as we go. We have no need in this program for a moderator, as this group, I can tell you, functions in a very civil manner, will not interrupt one another, and I should note, unanimously rejects white supremacy and racism. I promise you that this program will be a much more meaningful use of 90 minutes of your time. At the end of our remarks and the overview of the volume, we will have time for a Q&A and discussion. Please use the chat format, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen for now so I can show you the chat format that is at the bottom of your screen, and direct questions, if you have them, to everyone so that we may all see them. This program will be recorded in case you need to leave early or know someone who is unable to join. In the unlikely event of an unwanted interruption, we will simply pause the recording and then continue the program. One final note, I want to take a moment to offer tonight's program as a tribute to one of our contributors, Jeffrey Mcgargey, who passed away in August after a lengthy illness. Jeff Mcgargey was the senior applied research scholar at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies, where he was the project director and editor-in-chief of the museum's 7-volume Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos from 1933 to 1945. The first 3 volumes of this encyclopedia were published in 2009, 2012, and 2018, and the first volume won the National Jewish Book Award. He is also the author of Inside Hitler's Command in 2000 and War of Annihilation, Combat and Genocide on the Eastern Front. He was a member of the Holocaust Museum staff for over 20 years and was widely respected as an outstanding scholar and great colleague and friend throughout the museum community. And most importantly, as many of us who knew him can attest to, he was indeed a true mensch. So with those words of introduction, it is now my pleasure to turn over the screen to my wonderful co-editor and colleague, Laura Hilton.
Hey, I also have some quick thank yous. Avi has been a fantastic co-editor. I cannot imagine trying to corral 20 plus academics and teachers into getting a volume done on time. He's been fantastic in that regard. To our chapter authors, you guys worked on this so hard with us and met some really tight deadlines, and we really appreciate you for all the hard work that has made this volume amazing. Our series editors, who I believe are in this room somewhere, although I cannot see their faces, thanks for the phone call that said, hey, what do you think about taking on that project? Cannot tell you how much I appreciate that initial outreach, and then letting us really construct the book and choose the authors and the focus and taking the book where we thought it should best go. To the University of Wisconsin Press itself, I mean, you're sending out page proofs in the middle of a pandemic and moving the book along to production. And that was phenomenal considering that everybody was working from home and working in probably difficult circumstances. And of course, to all the attendees tonight, whether or not you are related to one of us, just know us, or have an interest in the topic, we do appreciate you taking the time to do this. Just a short word about the Harvey Goldberg series. This book is one in a long line of great books that has come out from this series from the University of Wisconsin Press. In case you have never heard of Harvey Goldberg, he earned his PhD at the University of Wisconsin back in 1963. His PhD was in French social history. He came back to Ohio and taught at Oberlin and the Ohio State University, but returned to Wisconsin, and there was known as an incredible lecturer, able to master not just the content of what he was teaching his students, but the ways in which he was able to convey information to him. So this series is about providing accurate, scholarly, peer-reviewed content and research, but also to help individuals figure out how they then take this information and use it in order to educate their students at either the college and university level or the high school level, and to really get students to critically engage with the past. In terms of the timing of this volume, Holocaust education has been in the news a bit in the past several weeks. There's been this confluence of 2 different surveys that have come out. The Echoes and Reflections survey, in case you're not familiar with them, they are a group that works together with the, it is the Yad Vashem, it is the US Shoah Foundation, and the ADL. And they came out with a survey that basically said students who have Holocaust education at the high school level, when they go on, and they surveyed 1,500 undergraduates at four-year colleges and universities, 80% of them had already had some kind of training in the Holocaust. So that is a plus. Don't worry, I'm going to get to the claims conference in just a minute. But these individuals who had training at that level, and we have several people who teach both high school, or they teach people how to teach high school here in this room tonight, they were more likely to be tolerant of other individuals who are different from them, and also more likely to challenge behavior that they saw as intolerant. So they have done this study to sort of see what happens with people who have had Holocaust education early and individuals who have not been introduced to it. I would also urge people, Margaret Myers-Feinstein could not be with us tonight, but in her chapter, she deals with the issue of testimony. And the other thing that I think this very important Echoes and Reflections survey found out is students said, hands down, one of the most impactful things that they learned when they learned about the Holocaust was being able to hear the words and see the faces of individuals who had endured the events that they were learning about. So the very important role played by testimony. In terms of the claims conference, I'm sure that you all have read about this online and perhaps read through the entire report. Parts of it are worrisome in some ways. There's a third of individuals surveyed who could not identify a single camp or a ghetto, 36%. 59%, which is up 9% from the survey they did in 2018, believe that the Holocaust could happen again. So if you compare the 18 and the 20 version, there are some very troubling trends there. One of the things I looked at was they asked people to mark various regions where they thought the Holocaust had occurred. And number one on the list was, of course, Germany. But I was very surprised that only 31% marked Poland as a site where the Holocaust had occurred. I'm sure when we all teach the subject, we talk about the northeast quadrant of Europe, and that is where the bulk of the killings take place at the hands of the Nazis as well as their collaborators. And more shockingly still, since it is the anniversary of Babi Yar, only 7% said that the Holocaust had occurred inside of the Ukraine. So obviously we have some work to do in terms of the geography and letting people know the full sweep of the Holocaust, which is one of the things I believe that this volume does so well. Lastly, in terms of timing, anti-Semitism, like many other intolerant things like inherent racism, is obviously on the rise. When Avi and I were finalizing this book project, Charlottesville happened in August of 2017. When we were working on first drafts, the New York Times let out a survey and they said 41% of Americans could not identify what Auschwitz was. When we were reading second drafts, there was the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue. And in December of 19, when we were working on final edits, there were attacks, deadly attacks in New Jersey, as well as an attack on a rabbi's house in New York. What this book means and what this webinar means, truth matters, accuracy matters, and the Holocaust is a necessary thing for us to teach, I would say even more than ever. So with that, I'm going to hand that back to Avi, who will then introduce Jonathan Lucan.
Great, thank you so much, Laura, and thank you for setting the tone and setting the stage for us on why this volume is so significant now, especially at this time. So as I said, we're going to proceed through, and let me just go into slideshow mode. So we're going to proceed through the volume according to the order of the chapters as they appear. And so I'll introduce each contributor before we get to each chapter. So you can see our first chapter that we'll be discussing is the first chapter in the volume, which deals with anti-Semitism, understanding its meaning, context, and history when teaching the Holocaust. Jonathan Ellicon is an associate professor of history at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. He received his PhD from Princeton University. He works in several fields, including the history of Jewish-Christian relations in medieval Europe, the history of law and kingship in the Middle Ages, early modern and modern historiography about Jews and Judaism, and the history of anti-Semitism. His first book is Living Together, Living Apart, Rethinking Jewish-Christian Relations in the Middle Ages, which was published in 2007. His essays have appeared in the Journal of the History of Ideas and other edited volumes of essays on the Middle Ages and Jewish history. So I turn it over to Jonathan Ellicon, and I'm going to stop the share so people can see you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Avi, and thank you, Laura, for this invitation to join this very distinguished group. It's a great opportunity for me to learn from everybody else, since teaching the Holocaust is not my field. So I really appreciate that chance. As Avi said, just to say a few words about the chapter, he actually gave me a little more time to prepare this than he did the other day in Shul, when he gave me 5 minutes to say something, 5 minutes warning to say something about Ella Ezkara. So I survived that, and hopefully I'll survive this as well. What I'd like to talk about is the demand for an explanation that the Holocaust presents us with. That is, it's an event that must be explained. And anti-Semitism has come to be what I think the easy explanation for that event. And I think it's become the easy explanation for several reasons, one of which is that people don't study the Middle Ages. You know, they don't study pre-modern European history, but that's another story. But if they did, I think they would see that the relationship between Jews and Christians from late antiquity through the Middle Ages and even into the early modern period, you know, it's quite complicated, quite nuanced, and very difficult to categorize in a very binary or Manichaean way, that there is always this, you know, as Sela Baron said, this lachrymose persecutorial model. Once you get beyond that, then the question becomes, all right, well, if it's not anti-Semitism, what is it? Thankfully, I don't have to answer that question. You guys have to answer that question. But what I would suggest is that relying on anti-Semitism as a kind of explanatory category obscures the nuances, the richness, the complicated nature of animosity towards the Jews, you know, through the centuries. And not just animosity towards the Jews, but the more complicated way in which Christians use Jews and appropriated Jews in Jewish history to answer their own internal needs, a kind of philo-Semitism, if you will, that is also very problematic. So I don't have an answer. The essay was meant to kind of challenge the basic assumption that we can rely on anti-Semitism as a catch-all explanation for animosity towards the Jews in the pre-modern and early modern period. And I would suggest that there's an equal level of complexity to attitudes towards Jews in the modern period, which you folks know more about certainly than I do. One of the things that was interesting as I was writing it, which I didn't expect, and I think this is due to an editorial query from Laura, was the impact of the Holocaust on contemporary anti-Semitism. And that was intriguing to think about, because it does create a way in which, or the power of the Holocaust, the imposing nature of it as an event and trauma, in a way kind of invigorates or inspires anti-Semitic thinking, because it is you know, such an, you'll forgive me, an amazing event, an awe-inspiring event in some ways. So it's the impact of the Holocaust itself is actually quite interesting when we look at how it affects contemporary anti-Semitism, or thinking about contemporary anti-Semitism. And again, I think there's a problem because it obscures the multiple origins and very complicated developmental pathways of contemporary anti-Semitism from the alt-right, from the Muslim world, from the far left, that all of that is also very difficult to be captured under one rubric of anti-Semitism. And then just to finish, and this comes back to an area that I'm more comfortable with, is that I think that there is something going on in Holocaust education, strictly as an outsider watching it, that really revisits the idea of supersessionism in an interesting way. That as people begin to use the Holocaust as a model for universal moral education, the Jews become a kind of Christ figure, if you will. The Jews become a tool of Christian or Gentile, broadly conceived, thinking about moral behavior, about sacrifice, about suffering. And I think there's a way in which we risk de-Judaizing the Holocaust as an experience because we have this desperate need to reach people and to universalize the message so it stays relevant and it stays alive in people's memories. So again, thank you very much for the opportunity to join you all, and I look forward to hearing about your work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And I do want to mention that for all of us who are contributors to the volume, before we began the program, we had a chance to actually, in many cases, meet each other for the first time. And this is a very unique opportunity for all of us to see each other and maybe even to ask each other questions as we get to the Q&A portion, because I think we're all going to say things that we find interesting. And indeed, that last point is a really fascinating and I think provocative point about sort of Holocaust and genocide education and the relationship between the two. My parents are in the audience, and I just want to make sure they know I wasn't actually in a synagogue building. I was outside in the backyard. Yes,
outside, socially distanced.
Putting Jonathan on the spot and saying, "Hey, do you want to say something about the martyrology in the Yom Kippur service?" So our next speaker, and I'm just going to go back to the PowerPoint so we can see the table of contents. So our next speaker, speaking on the rise of Nazism, is Mark Spica. Mark Spica is professor of history at Shippensburg University. He earned his PhD from the Ohio State University in 2000 in modern European and German history. He is the author of Selling the Economic Miracle, Economic Reconstruction and Politics in West Germany, 1949 to 1957. He has published articles in German History, German Studies Review, German Politics and Society, Journal of Contemporary History, and Immigrants and Minorities, and is currently researching guest workers and city policy in West Germany in the 1960s and 70s. And I'm just going to advance to show a slide that has the image. Is that the
right
chapter? Sorry.
It's the next one.
The next
I think
one.
it's the next one.
Yeah.
There it is.
So
great.
Go ahead, Mark.
Got it. Thank you, Avi and Laura. Thank you for pulling together this wonderful panel, and I'm really excited to participate. So when Laura talked to me a long time ago about writing this chapter, I was very excited, and I started spinning in my mind all the different things I could talk about, and the complexities, and working in pedagogical approaches, and talking about the rise of the Nazis. And she said, well, you've got 12 pages, so, you know, boil it down, reel it back a little bit, Mark. So with that in mind, what I focused on in my chapter were the Nazi electoral strategies during the Weimar Republic, and how the Nazis operated electorally within the political and social context of the Weimar Republic. So I had to exclude, obviously, a lot of different things, and didn't delve into issues such as the destruction of the Weimar Republic following the naming of Hitler as chancellor in January 1933, for example. In terms of the key takeaways, I think, for teachers, for students, I hope I conveyed in my chapter a number of things. I think one is that, you know, the Nazis coming to power was not inevitable following the defeat in World War I and the conditions of the Treaty of Versailles. I think that's an important thing to try and convey to students. And I think oftentimes students sort of think about, well, it's just this natural progression from defeat to the rise of the Nazis, and to get them to think a little bit more about the complexities of what led to the rise of the Nazis and their ultimate success working within the Weimar system and ultimately destroying it. And as part of thinking about that, I'd like to try and get my students to think about how the Nazis as a political movement were unique in Germany during the Weimar Republic. Students, I stress to students to try and understand that the Nazis were a successful political movement because they could effectively talk to various constituencies across social and cultural lines, and really in ways that other German political parties weren't able to do or were unsuccessful in doing during the Weimar Republic. So with that in mind, to be sure, anti-Semitism was always a big part of the Nazi message. But I think it's also important to keep in mind of how the Nazis tapped into various social and nationalist concerns of the German electorate as a whole. They weren't just a protest movement. They weren't just a reaction to the Treaty of Versailles. In teaching, I think the significance of teaching the rise of the Nazis and thinking about how electoral politics worked in the Weimar Republic, I think it lends itself to teaching the Holocaust as a whole, because it shows how in time many, if not most, Germans accommodated themselves or embraced the Nazi worldview. And also, I think it's really important in terms of taking a look at the rise of the Nazis, is to think about how even before the Third Reich came to power, they were already dividing society into insiders and outsiders, and how within electoral system, how dangerous that can be. And I think, given our current situation, I think that's a lesson that that we should heed quite seriously. And so those are some of the things that I was trying to convey in this chapter. So.
Thank you so much, Mark. And I think I'm sure many of those in the viewing audience are thinking about those sort of contemporary comparisons, and we might get some questions in the Q&A, specifically thinking about how a party like this can exploit the weaknesses of democracy and use it against itself.
Right.
So thank you. So our next chapter in the volume is again, one that follows on sort of this way of using democracy against itself in a sense, and it's called Legislation as a Path to Persecution. The authors of this volume are Russell Lemons, who of this chapter are Russell Lemons and Laura Hilton. Russell Lemons, who's a distinguished professor of history at Jacksonville State University in Alabama, unfortunately was not able to join us this evening, but his co-author and volume co-editor, Laura Hilton, is here to say a few words about this chapter. And Laura, I think I have this image for the chapter.
This chapter, when we originally envisioned it, was supposed to pick up, and of course in a volume of this size you cannot teach all of the history at once. There are other books that do that. But the idea was to have this be the chapter that picked up where Mark left off, and talking about how we got to 1933, and then to sort of be the bridge to Alana's chapter, which we'll talk about next, that talks about specific persecution of the Jews, and in particular focuses on what happens after the Anschluss in Austria. When teaching the Third Reich, I think one of the most important things, to piggyback on what Mark said about saying the Nazis coming to power was not inevitable, was to also disabuse people, students and others out in the public, or even Facebook, I guess if we dare, that Hitler did not seize power by force. His party won 37.4% of the popular vote in the July 32 election. Then actually vote total went down in the November 32 election. And when he was named as chancellor, he did head up the largest party in what would become the Third Reich, but they were nowhere near a clear majority in order to be able to pass legislation. So it is, as Avi said, how it is that the Third Reich uses the democracy inside of what's left of the Weimar Constitution to be able to exploit that. So the chapter, first of all, introduces the idea of the importance of the Rekhstat, the idea that Germans were wedded to having a state that operated according to equality in the eyes of the law, and that there was an independent judiciary that would ensure that those laws were applied equally to all. Obviously, this runs quickly afoul of the Nazi vision for how different groups in their society should be treated. As Mark said, they very quickly divide themselves into who is inside the people's community, the Volksgemeinschaft, and then those who fall outside of the people's community. The chapter explains how the Nazis use various kinds of ways and mechanisms in order to separate, to target, and to persecute different groups of people. It, of course, spends a large amount of time talking about legislation that specifically targets the Jews. And the chart that Avi is showing right now comes from, thank you to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum for letting us use this image to help explain what are perhaps some of the most famous laws, the Nuremberg racial laws promulgated in the fall of 1935. But those were just one piece of many acts of legislation at the federal level, and sometimes even before the federal level, at the local and regional level. They use these things in order to build up social approval for allowing people to not be treated equally in the eyes of the law. So again, subverting the idea of the democratic process. And they posited this, and many Germans agreed with it, that this was necessary to basically subvert the Rekhstat in order to protect the people's community. It engages students in critical thinking about how discrimination can actually be built into legislation and into a system. We live in the United States of America. I don't think we, probably most of the audience, needs to be reminded of how this is done. But not only how it's built, but how it gets accepted. So the chapter, as I said, talks about the persecution of Jews through the use of legislation, also the mentally and physically handicapped, the Roma and the Sinti, gay men, and also there was a short paragraph on the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses. It's really important for students to walk away from this chapter and from a course on the Holocaust with understanding the role that legislation can play in protecting the basic rights of its citizens, or actually stripping those rights away by telling some people that they are less worthy and that they are not, in fact, citizens. I think it is also an important chapter and branches out to talk about larger ripple effects of what is happening inside of Nazi Germany, connecting with the larger history of both eugenics and sterilization, and how both race and social class build the system of insiders and outsiders. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Laura. So one thing that I should note in the way that the volume is organized is that we have these two parts. And so the first part is teaching specific content. And the second part is organized to use specific source material and specific types of materials to teach that content. So as you'll see, we have both the historical context and then how to use specific types of material to teach that material. So our next chapter in the volume, and I'll just go back here to the image, is by Ilana Offenberger, and it deals with Jewish responses to Nazism in Vienna after the Anschluss. And I'll just mention that this was a chapter, they're all personal in one way or another, but in the dedication to the volume, I specifically dedicated this volume to my great-grandparents, Zvi Hirsch and Dvorah Heilacher, who were deported from Vienna in April of 1942. We think ultimately they ended up in Sobibor, but we don't know for sure. And so I was especially grateful that Ilana was able to write this chapter for us on Jewish responses to Nazism in Vienna after the Anschluss. Ilana F. Offenberger is a scholar of history and author of the publication, The Jews of Nazi Vienna, 1938 to 1945, Rescue and Destruction, published by Palgrave Macmillan as a part of a larger series in the history of genocide. She received a PhD in history from Clark University in 2010. And since 2012, she's been teaching in the Department of History at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. She offers courses on the history of the Holocaust and other topics in European history. And Offenberger is president of the American Friends of the Documentation Center of Austrian Resistance. Ilana.
So thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here tonight. Thank you to Avi and Laura and to everyone that's here. It's an honor to contribute my research expertise to this Harvey Goldberg series for understanding and teaching history. And this volume specifically dedicated to teaching and understanding the Holocaust, I believe is essential in our time of 2020. My particular chapter deals with the complexity of human responses to Nazi oppression in Vienna, Austria in 1938, just after the Anschluss. I highlight unique examples of Nazi violence and investigate private reactions to such aggression, humiliation, and dehumanization. I bring awareness to the concept of identity, to its complexity, and to the privilege one has today, our students have today, to choose their identity. As a scholar and an educator, I find myself continuously learning and finding motivation from both the individuals that I uncover in the archives, those identities, and from my students and their identities. So this opportunity to compose a short chapter, which is a way to bring these two critical sources together and form that bridge. As I summarized in the final lines of the chapter, and I don't want to tell too much about the chapter and give the cliff notes away because it is short and I want my students to read it, and some of them are here. But I wrote this to help students, in order for students to grasp an accurate understanding of Jewish responses to Nazism in Germany between 1933 and 1938. It is essential that classes begin by investigating the experiences of individuals, so private individual experiences in different locations at specific points in time after Hitler's rise to power, and to carefully scrutinize their various trajectories. Then too, we can return these individuals the basic freedom that was taken from them, their identity. By making connections to their own identity through this study and examining our own actions and inactions to hatred in the 21st century, we can also highlight the importance of choosing to participate before it's too late. So this chapter was really written with my students in mind. And as I was reminded today, just after class, it is the stories of the real people who live through the history that stick with us, not the numbers. So in this chapter, I have offered specific examples of rare and unique violence against Jews, and then Jewish responses such as denial, initial denial, another Jewish response, which was to take immediate flight, and another Jewish response, which was to take their lives immediately. And I unpack these different responses looking at specific people, specific families. If I, as an educator, can use my research, the archives, to empower these young thinkers with the knowledge and assist young activists with empathy, then at the very least, I believe that those who lost their identity in the Holocaust will not have completely died in vain. So that's a bit of an introduction to my chapter, and I'm happy to take questions and get into the details more during our Q&A. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Ilana, and thank you for contributing such a wonderful chapter. As you'll see, so our next two chapters, as I noted before, Jeffrey Mcgargey passed away over the summer, and we're very sad that he is no longer with us. Waitman Bjorn, the author of a chapter, an outstanding and very concise but powerful chapter on understanding the Holocaust in the context of World War II, is in England, which is where he teaches, and it's a little bit too late there to expect him to be awake at this hour, but it's really an outstanding chapter on the broader context of the Second World War and looking at both the crimes of the Wehrmacht and understanding the policies of mass killing that took place within the broader context of the war. It's really essential reading and critical new research that we're so happy that was able to be in this volume. And then, of course, as you heard from my introduction and the bio of Jeffrey Mcgargey, this monumental project, the Encyclopedia of Concentration Camps, and in a moment we'll hear from Martin Dean on the Encyclopedia of Ghettos, has really opened up new pathways into Holocaust studies, into the universe, really the universe of persecution. And as Jeff titled his chapter, Tools of the State, the Universe of Nazi Camps. So our next chapter is by Martin Dean, of the Decentralized System of Nazi Ghettos in Eastern Europe. And Martin received a PhD in European history from Queen's College in Cambridge. He has worked as a researcher for the Special Investigations Unit in Sydney, Australia, and as the senior historian for the Metropolitan Police War Crimes Unit in London. As an applied research scholar at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, he was the volume editor for the Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos, specifically the volume on ghettos. His publications include Collaboration in the Holocaust in 2000 and Robbing the Jews in 2008, which won a National Jewish Book Award in 2009. He is based in Washington, D.C., and works as a historical consultant for the Babi Yar Holocaust Memorial Center and as an advisor on film documentaries, and also as an instructor at Keene University. So Martin, I will scroll down to your images. Go ahead.
Well, thank you, Avi, and also to Laura for the fantastic job you both did putting this volume together. I know what enormous effort it takes to get 20 or so contributors to get everything together on time, so I'm very pleased to have this available. Now that I've started teaching, you tend to see things from a slightly different perspective, but I do like this image that you see here. It sort of makes the point that I'm trying to make with my short chapter on ghettos. Having sort of edited a 2,000-page volume on ghettos, it's obviously hard to just confine it to 10 or 15 pages. But I think what I want to say is that there's much more than just the Warsaw Ghetto and the Łódź Ghetto and maybe one or two other well-known ghettos to the history of ghettos. And what strikes one is particularly the difference to the concentration camp system, which is highly documented, very centralized and organized, although there are of course differences between the different camps, and over time the concentration camps change a lot. But the ghettos are very much a decentralized and local initiative to some extent. It's not built into the final solution right from the start. It's kind of used as a tool towards the climax of the final solution. But the initial idea was just to isolate the Jews from the rest of the population and to allow the Germans to sort of get access to resources in cities where they really wanted it, such as Warsaw. In other places like Krakow, for example, they even moved most of the Jews out of the city, and the ghetto itself was relatively small. The larger ghetto in southern Poland was not in Krakow, but in a neighboring town. But what you see here is the enormous extent of ghettos to the east. And this is, again, what we were discussing earlier, the lack of knowledge about the geographical spread of the Holocaust and how it was implemented in different areas. These different areas are using the German administrative districts because it played such a huge role in how the Holocaust was implemented. It really made a difference if you were in Vice Ruthenian or Lithuania. And some Jews fled from Lithuania to Vice Ruthenian because almost all of these ghettos were liquidated by the end of 1941, while many of the ghettos in Vice Ruthenian survived into 1942. So the way to tell this story to students is obviously not to try and give them the whole picture, although I think there are things you can do with the encyclopedia, because you could assign different ghetto entries to individual students and then get them to sort of compare the similarities and differences, and there's a lot of information there. And we know so much more now about these many ghettos than we did before. It was really quite a shock that the estimate of the number of ghettos by the Holocaust Museum when I started this project was around 400. If you include, obviously, Hungary and Romania, there's about another 300 or so ghettos there. Also in this part, Transnistria has ghettos. They're not included in this volume or in this essay because I'm dealing with the ones ruled by the Germans, the Nazis specifically. But as you can see, there's a huge number of small ghettos, and even ghettos in places in Russia and right down here. They weren't perhaps strictly ghettos, but there were places where Jews were confined even as the Germans were advancing down here towards Stalingrad. So there's an enormous diversity of experience and conditions. And what you see about the smaller ghettos especially is that there were not even necessarily fences. There might be just a rule that people weren't allowed to leave the ghetto. Initially, it wouldn't be enforced, but then at some point, people might even get shot. Yeah, this is a good example here. There is actually a barbed wire fence here, but it's not a fence that's impenetrable. So the sort of hermetically sealed Łódź ghetto or the high walls of the Warsaw ghetto were not necessarily the case in the other smaller ghettos. And many of the ghettos didn't last as long either, but I don't think that sort of diminishes or changes the experience of Jews in ghettos. One of the things that strikes you is even when there was no fence, not too many Jews really did try to escape, and even when they did, they knew that there was a high chance that they would be exposed and not be able to survive. One of the most shocking things to me was that there were places where Jews escaped from the ghettos, and then because they found it so difficult to live outside, they even went back into ghettos, or what they called sometimes sort of ghettos that were kept, remnant ghettos that existed after the main ghettos had been liquidated. Jews would come back out of hiding into these remnant ghettos because they simply couldn't survive outside. So this leads to the next chapter on collaboration, which is a particularly hot topic in Eastern Europe now. I know Jan Grabowski is still sort of fighting for his life to some extent in Poland for his honesty in admitting the extent of collaboration in that country. But collaboration is a key topic. And even for the small ghettos, there was not the solidarity one would have hoped for. It was very hard for people to survive. Just a final note on Babi Yar. There was actually no ghetto in Kiev. Babi Yar was one of the first places where they literally decided to try and kill almost all of the Jewish population in one fell swoop, in one go, on the 29th to the 30th of September. My research there has been actually quite invigorating, dealing with a totally different type of material. I've used aerial photography and ground photography and used those to try and locate exactly where the shooting took place. And we're really finding out new information even 79 years after the events took place that we can now say with a high degree of certainty by combining those with witness testimonies. What I did with the witness testimonies is I put them into a computer system so you can actually look for geographical references, and then I found a huge number of testimonies that give enough information to sort of locate where specific events took place, and especially where the mass shooting took place. So we have some new information on Babi Yar, and we're still learning about the Holocaust so long afterwards. So with that, I'll pass it on to you. Thank you for the opportunity, Abby. It's been a good talking to you.
Thank you so much, Martin, and thank you for sharing your expertise, not only on ghettos, but broadly on the scope of German policy throughout Europe. And as you suggested, it is a good segue to our next chapter, which I'm actually going to stop the share for a moment. And our next chapter is teaching about collaboration, a case study approach by Stephen P. Remy. So Stephen Remy is a professor of history at the City University of New York, Brooklyn College, and the Graduate Center, where he teaches courses on modern Germany and European history. He is the author of The Malmedy Massacre, The War Crimes Trial Controversy in 2017 was published, and The Heidelberg Myth, The Nazification and Denazification of a German University, published in 2003. Steve.
Thank you, Avi, and thank you, Laura and Avi, for all of your hard work in making this possible, and thank you to the hosts. Certainly my condolences go out to the friends and family and colleagues of Jeff Mcgargey. It's a terrible loss for our profession, and I'll never forget his kind and encouraging words to me as a graduate student years ago, and not least his incredible work. If there's a single takeaway, well, first of all, Jonathan's comment at the outset that the Holocaust demands explanation is of course, so true. I find that it also resists it, making teaching an extraordinary challenge. If there's a single takeaway that I could put out there, or I would like readers to take away from my contribution, was that the Holocaust was a German-initiated pan-European assault on a vulnerable minority. Or maybe to put it another way, the Holocaust could not have taken place the way that it did without extensive trans-European collaboration. But that's about as general as I go in terms of the way I approach teaching the subject, because I take a case study approach. I found that an effective way to teach the subject, and I emphasize in my courses what I write about in the chapter, a section on France, a section on Poland, and a section on parts of the Arab world. And I found that it works pretty well. I found two related, it works very well, I think. It found two related benefits to the case study approach. For one, it conveys variety. And it's difficult, and I make it difficult to come up with a single one-size-fits-all definition of collaboration. And this can sometimes lead to frustratingly inconclusive classroom discussions, but that's kind of the point. The point is to stress complexity and to stress variety, and really, if anybody is making sweeping generalizations, it's the far right in France and Poland and elsewhere, which accuses historians of blanket condemnations of the French or of Poland, and this is not anything that any responsible historian does. So there's variety and complexity, I think, that comes out in the case study approach. And I think it also allows students to explore cases of collaboration in greater depth than they would had I tried to cover all of Europe, or all of German-controlled Europe. In the case of France, I use Tatiana de Rosnay's novel, Sarah's Key. It was made into a film. I don't think the film is particularly, it's not as good as the book, I think. The book is short, it's compelling. Students really get into it. And some of the background of how Tatiana de Rosnay came to write the book is also instructive. In Poland, I do focus on the Jedwabne case, although increasingly I'm drawing from Jan Grabowski's work and the trouble that he has gotten himself into on the Polish Blue Police. But Jedwabne and Jan Gross's book also makes for really stimulating class discussions. I can also recommend Władysław Pazykowski's 2012 film Aftermath, which is not that well known in the United States, but it's makes for a very good visual accompaniment to to Jan Gross's book. Now, the last thing I'll say is increasingly, I'm also trying to place collaboration in a global comparative context. And I think to the list of recent developments that Laura mentioned at the outset, I would add the, in my view, extremely disturbing, extremely disappointing statement from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum from June of 2019 that rejects efforts to create analogies between the Holocaust and other genocides. Making analogies and making comparisons is what historians do. I was encouraged by the tremendous response that came a month later from hundreds of our colleagues in the New York Review of Books. Making comparisons is what we do. I think scholars of the Holocaust and teachers of the Holocaust have a tremendous amount to add to our understanding of genocide as a wider global phenomenon. It's, I think, always been necessary to do so since World War II. Now, with events in Myanmar and the fact that we have concentration camps operating on US soil, it's particularly pressing, along with all of the terrible events that have come up, or terrible recent events that came up earlier in the discussion. So I'm happy to, of course, take any questions that anybody in the audience has, and thank you again for this wonderful opportunity.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Stephen. And as you alluded to many of the films that you use in your teaching, it strikes me that in a little bit, we'll be hearing from Alan Marcus, who also has authored an excellent chapter on teaching the Holocaust through film. And there's so much dialogue that we can have between these chapters. And as you mentioned, between sort of comparative work and then contemporary events, which constantly forces us to rethink our forms of analysis. The next chapter in the volume is authored by Laura Hilton and deals with resistance and rescue. And Laura, do you want to say a few brief remarks about that chapter?
I am, and I'm going to keep it brief because you've already heard from me twice. I think that when we teach issues of rescue and resistance in our courses, be they a month-long course or be they a semester-long course or more than that, rescue and resistance are one of those things that everybody's like, okay, let's talk about how there were people who actually helped Jews. And one of the things I say in this chapter pretty strongly is that although students need to have that break from unrelenting, difficult, horrible, emotional situations that we're asking them to read about and listen to and watch, we also have to remind them that there's 700 million people in Europe at the time of the Second World War-ish, and the vast majority of them do not help Jews. Some of them are indifferent to Jewish suffering, some of them economically, socially benefit from Jewish suffering, and some of them are more directly involved in persecution. So the framework for this chapter on rescue and resistance is, yes, we need to acknowledge that this occurred, but at the same time put it in the context of, please understand how rare this really was. I encourage educators when they're looking at particularly the definition of resistance to spend some time talking with their students about how the definition of resistance has changed. The scholarly approach to it early on was mainly to focus on armed and violent resistance, which is incredibly important to know that that occurred in extermination camps, in ghettos, in concentration camps, in labor camps. There was armed and violent resistance. The problem, however, is if that is the only way that resistance is coded and the way that we explain it, we're missing out on the very rich historiography that exploded in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s that delved into ways that Jews worked together collectively or in small groups. You need to delve into the issue of Jewish self-help, which I think is only something which has really emerged in the scholarship in the past decade-ish. And I also do an exercise with them where I ask them to write down things that they think fit within the definition of resistance. And I have moved away from an idea that we create a hierarchy and we actually begin to group things. I hand out index cards and they can write down as many ideas as they want. And then we actually group them on a big desk in the middle of the classroom. And one of the things I would say, two more things to say. One, when we broaden the definition of resistance, we remember the ladies. We remember the women who may have been involved directly in violent and armed resistance. We might remember the women who smuggle the explosives out of a factory in Auschwitz that then lead to the explosion at the crematorium. But we also need to think about the women who could pass as Aryan, who acted as smugglers of information and or people and or food. And that when we broaden this definition and we include things like the archive that is uncovered at Warsaw, and we talk about who were the people who gathered this information and did these interviews, it is a much richer and much more powerful explanation of all of the different ways that Jews tried to survive. And I think that this does a greater service than simply focusing on violent uprisings. Last thing that I will say is there is about a third of the chapter that deals with rescue. And I deal directly with the fact that the vast majority of national governments did not engage in any large-scale rescue, but then highlight multiple specific groups of people. And again, trying to do geographic spread here, I talk about groups that are in the Netherlands and in Belgium and in France. So students understand that Jews were in peril in all of these places. And then use some evidence from sociologists and anthropologists about why it is some people might be rescuers, to again push back against the idea that sometimes 18 to 22-year-olds have in our classes that if they were alive during the Holocaust, they would have helped. And that then asks them to think about their behavior and how they interact with people today. Sorry, that was longer than I thought it was going to be. Avi, you should talk now.
Thank you, Laura. And yeah, and thank you for sharing. All of the chapters are important and central to the volume, but I think it's important to communicate, the ways in which, and get teachers to think about the ways in which they teach about resistance and teach about rescue, which often become the focal point of teaching. And I think you ask them to think critically about how they do that. So it's a very important chapter in the volume. I'll be extremely brief in talking about the chapter that I authored, which deals with life in the aftermath, Jewish displaced persons. And many of you know this is the main topic that I focus on in my research and writing, which is Jewish life in the aftermath of the war. And one of the components that I want educators to think about when they teach about the history of the Holocaust is to broaden the chronology, to not just focus on the outbreak of the war, not just focus on the process of persecution, but also focus on the end stages of the war, that is the death marches to liberation, the liberation of the camps, and then what happens to survivors in the immediate aftermath of the war, the rich, diverse life that is created in the displaced persons camps, the ways in which survivors play a crucial role in organizing historical commissions to conduct some of the first historical studies in the DP camps, Jewish youth who create kibbutzim in the aftermath of the war throughout Germany, demonstrating their Zionist enthusiasm, which plays an important role then in diplomatic decisions that lead to the creation of the State of Israel. All too often, the aftermath of the war and the period of the displaced persons camps is sort of forgotten. And I want teachers to ask their students to think about what happens the day after liberation. What happens a week? What happens a month? What happens a year after liberation? What do you do once your entire world is destroyed? How do you go on? And we often talk to our students about resilience. And I think this is an interesting case study for them to look at survivors in the aftermath of the war and think about the wherewithal. How do people move on with their lives? How do they have the resilience to not only memorialize the past, to deal with an extraordinary present where they don't know where their future is going to be, and yet continue with their lives, and in many ways set the way for the types of historical study that we do today. So I will stop myself there, but that is the focus of my chapter. And as is the case in all of these chapters, we include materials in the chapters that ask educators provide suggestions for ways to think about teaching this topic. The next chapter, after my chapter, is authored by Gabi Finder. And Gabi, I know this is not in your chapter, but actually, sorry, this is the image from your chapter, my apologies. The chapter is Post-War Trials and Justice. And Gabi Finder is a professor in the Department of Germanic Languages and Literatures and former Ida and Nathan Koloditz Director of Jewish Studies at the University of Virginia. His teaching and research interests include the Holocaust, Holocaust-related trials, and the rebuilding of Jewish life in Europe after the Holocaust. He is the co-editor with Laura Yokush of Jewish Honor Courts, Revenge, Retribution, and Reconciliation in Europe and Israel after the Holocaust, which was a 2016 National Jewish Book Award finalist in the Holocaust category. He's the co-author with Alexander Prusin of Justice Behind the Iron Curtain, Nazis on Trial in Communist Poland in 2018, and a co-editor of a new volume, which also came out this year, co-edited with David Sluky and myself, and the volume is called Laughter After Humor and the Holocaust. So happy to turn it over to Gabi Finder.
Thank the editors, Laura and Avi, for this opportunity to contribute to this outstanding and timely volume. The title of my chapter is Post-War Trials and Justice, and I decidedly or studiously avoid the term war crimes trials. As our colleague Devin Pendis has observed, it's a flawed term. Nazi crimes were not committed in the prosecution of a conventional war. The aim of those crimes was not to help win World War II, but to dehumanize and enslave civilian populations and to carry out genocide against them. Therefore, I don't use the term war crimes trials. I use the term post-war trials, post-war justice, trials of Nazis. In my chapter, I discuss various post-war trials, including, among many others, the 1945 to 1946 Nuremberg trial or International Military Tribunal, the 1961 Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, the 1963 to 1965 Frankfurt Auschwitz trial, and even the 2010 trial of John Demjanjuk in Munich. Avi, you can remove the image now if you'd like. These trials set the stage in my chapter for asking weighty questions, which in my view are important to consider with students. Questions such as, what is justice? What does justice mean after the Holocaust and in the wake of other atrocities? How is justice attained in this context? How is it measured? By whom? For whom? More concretely, can post-war justice be deemed a success? Did the trials related to the Holocaust serve the cause of justice, sufficiently punishing the perpetrators while vindicating the grievances of the victims? So that's what I deal with in my chapter. Some scholars think so. Some scholars think that post-war justice was a success, but most scholars are skeptical. Historian Rebecca Whitman powerfully expresses this skepticism, and I quote her in my chapter, I quote, "Is rendering justice possible after a crime of such magnitude as the Holocaust? Can a legal system possibly come to terms with the atrocities committed by the Nazis and atone for the guilt of hundreds of thousands? The answer is obvious. No punishment exists that fits the crime." End of quote. There are many examples in support of Whitman's skepticism, and I discuss them in my chapter. Whitman and Pendis have written first-rate books on the Frankfurt Auschwitz trial, for example. Both of them describe the woefully inadequate punishments imposed on the 20 defendants, former Auschwitz personnel who were tried. In the end, 6 were convicted of murder and received life in prison. 11 were convicted of aiding and abetting and received sentences ranging from 3 to 14 years in prison. 3 were acquitted. but the two highest officials indicted were not convicted of murder, but only of being accessories to murder. And by 1989, 13 of the convicted defendants had been released from prison. Another example related to Auschwitz. It's estimated that 7,000 to 7,200 people served at the Auschwitz camp complex, and that at war's end, 6,300 to 6,500 were still alive, but only 15% ever stood trial in various countries. And yet, as I show in my chapter, there were trials that could be deemed as delivering justice, such as the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem. Eichmann was convicted and hanged. My late friend and colleague, Alexander Prusin, and I argued in our 2018 book, Justice Behind the Iron Curtain, Nazis on Trial in Communist Poland, that there were trials of Nazis conducted in Communist Poland, such as the 1946 trial of Amon Goeth, the commandant of Płaszów, the 1947 trial of Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, and the 1951 trial of Jürgen Stroop, the SS general who directed the final liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto and the brutal suppression of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, that were essentially fair and delivered justice. All of these defendants were convicted and hanged. I also tried to show in my chapter that victims of the Holocaust, Jews, were active, not just passive, but active in the process of delivering post-war justice. They acted as amateur historians or even as professional historians, as expert witnesses in court. They were witnesses in court against those who had been their perpetrators and tormentors. And I also mentioned in my chapter, and this was the subject of the book that I co-edited with Laura Yokosh a few years ago, Jewish honor courts. Those were Jewish communal courts in Europe that investigated fellow Jews who were suspected of having dirty hands, and in those few cases actually brought them to justice in a court of their Jewish peers. All of these efforts by Jews to help bring Nazis to justice were emotionally challenging. And I would say that if there's one, I was thinking of what I missed in my chapter and what I've missed in my scholarship. And I think that is something that I would like to work on in the future. That is the emotional challenge of being a witness for the victims, and the emotional challenge of helping bring their tormentors to justice. I end my chapter affirming scholar Lawrence Douglas's position that what mattered most in trials of Nazis was, what matters most in trials of perpetrators of atrocities in general is the very fact of passing judgment. And if I may, I'll quote the last paragraph of my chapter, which is very short. All things considered, one might ultimately generalize from the conclusion that Alexander Prusin and I found in the Polish context. Post-war justice in Poland and elsewhere was far from perfect, but at the very least, as far as the trials of German and Austrian Nazis were concerned, a certain justice was done. Thank you so much. And once again, Laura and Avi, thank you for inviting me to contribute to what I think is an extremely important, significant, and timely volume.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gabi. And again, thank you for your wonderful chapter and your contribution to the volume. I note that people are typing questions into the Q&A, which is wonderful. So please, if you have questions for our contributors, after hearing them speak, you can type them into the Q&A. And for our panelists, we have the capacity to respond directly in writing if you want, if it's a question that you can respond to in writing. If not, we'll try to get to the Q&A at the end of the program. So now on to the second part of our volume, which deals with sources, methods, and media for teaching the Holocaust. And the first chapter in this section of the book, the second part of the book, is by Amy Simon, and it deals with teaching with Holocaust diaries, voices from the chasm. Amy Simon holds the William and Audrey Farber Family Chair in Holocaust Studies and European Jewish History at Michigan State University. She teaches in James Madison College, the Department of History, and the Michael and Elaine Serling Institute for Jewish Studies and Modern Israel. She was previously worked as a researcher at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and regularly participates in workshops and conferences in the United States and Israel. Her work on Holocaust fiction, memoir, and diaries has appeared in Holocaust Studies, a journal of culture and history, Jewish Historical Studies, the Journal of Jewish Identities, and several edited volumes. Amy Simon.
Thank you so much, Avi and Laura. And it was also, as everybody has said, quite a pleasure for me to contribute to this, and actually very timely, as I was asked to contribute this chapter during the summer after my first year at this position. And Avi mentioned that I teach in the James Madison College, which is a residential teaching college on the campus of Michigan State University. And because it's residential and it's undergraduate, its focus is pedagogy. So in fact, this aligns very well with my trajectory in my career. So thank you for the opportunity. And so I think, though, that I was asked to to write the chapter because my research is on Holocaust diaries. And in fact, in my research, diaries are my primary source. So my research looks at Holocaust diaries written in Yiddish in Warsaw, Łódź, and Vilna ghettos, and looks at victim perceptions of perpetrators in those diaries. And the point of my research is to try to uncover something different, something new about the everyday lived experience of people in those ghettos. So it's not surprising that, because this is my research, this would also be something I bring into my teaching. And in fact, I do teach. Every class that I teach has a Holocaust diary component in it. And when I started researching for this chapter, I thought to myself, well, what do other people teach? You know, I had some colleagues and friends, and I knew anecdotally what people do in their classrooms, but I also spent some time researching on databases of national syllabi in major organizations to see what other people who do Holocaust studies teach. And I found a really surprising lack of diaries in these syllabi. There's always a lot of memoir and film and oral testimony, all of which is super important, which I also teach with, of course, but very few and very little diary, especially in literary studies and history. And so I thought, well, that's surprising to me because I know the value of diaries. And so the chapter really argues for the importance of teaching with Holocaust diaries for understanding, as we've already spoken about today, and which I'm sure many more of the contributors will also talk about, for understanding the individual, right? Understanding a personal experience that somebody had. I'm Jewish, I do Jewish studies. And so for me, it's also about understanding things from a Jewish perspective. And so understanding the everyday, slow uncovering of information that people had while they lived in the ghettos. And diaries is I think, the best source to get at that. It's daily or very close to daily, and it's personal, it's intimate. And so on the one hand, it's great as a source to understand something, the cultural history of the people, the religious history, and the daily experience. And it's also important pedagogically because we know that students respond. Students respond to individual stories. It helps make it understandable and knowable. And particularly with diaries, they feel like they know these people. And honestly, I feel like I know the people whose diaries I use in my research as well. You're reading somebody's innermost thoughts, and it's enormously powerful. And of course, as educators, the first thing we want to do is engage our students so that they can learn and understand and be open. So the chapter goes through a number of different ways I've taught with diaries, showing how different they can be, and they can be in the classroom used in a whole variety of ways: full diaries, portions of diaries, different literature classes, history classes, even memory classes, which might not make sense, but it's in there. So I really advocate for the use of diaries, and they're enormously accessible, and I hope that the chapter gives some models on interesting ways to use them more in the classroom. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. And one of the things that your chapter also shows is how much the field has expanded in terms of our research on diaries. For many years, the focal point of teaching was on the diary of Anne Frank, and you show just how far beyond, in terms of the volumes, thousands of diaries which were created and can be used for research and teaching. And I did not mention in your biography, but it is important to point out that Amy, like me, is also from Houston, Texas. So a very important biographical point. Our next chapter, which moves from teaching with Holocaust diaries to strategies for teaching with Holocaust with memoirs. And many of the contributors to the volume are gifted educators, and our next contributor falls into this category for sure. Jennifer Goss holds an MA in Holocaust and Genocide Studies from Westchester University of Pennsylvania. She has worked as a high school social studies teacher since 2002 and currently teaches in Staunton, Virginia, where her course load includes an elective in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. In the evenings, Jennifer teaches courses in the United States history and world civilizations at Blue Ridge Community College. In addition to her work in the classroom, she is a USHMM Teacher Fellow of 2010 and serves as a facilitator for several programs, including the Anti-Defamation League's Echoes and Reflections program. In 2012, she produced the student-created Emmy-nominated documentary Misa's Fugue with colleagues, and in 2016, she co-authored the memoir Remember My Child with survivor Itka Zygmuntovich. So it's a pleasure to introduce Jennifer Goss.
Thank you, Avi. It's an honor to be part of this work, building this bridge between scholarship and educational practice. Since I began my work in the classroom, I felt that teaching with memoirs is a way to allow students to view the Holocaust through another lens that both complements and enhances the work that we do in the classroom. And so my goal with this chapter is to provide readers with a brief overview of the history of Holocaust survivor memoirs as an introduction to the section's main focus on strategies to engage students respectfully and thoughtfully in using memoirs in their study of the Holocaust. So the various approaches to teaching memoirs that are shared within this chapter approach this topic in teaching them in both full and excerpted form, with the idea that these strategies are adaptable across a variety of subject areas, since the Holocaust is truly multidisciplinary. Topics included in the chapter include how to select memoirs based on your teaching rationale, the importance of contextualization when using memoirs in the classroom, which is explored further in Victoria Aaron's chapter that follows this particular chapter. Strategies for the use of memoirs, both in person and virtually, as well as recommended resources to supplement their use. Certainly when work on this chapter began, virtual instruction was a partial or non-existent thought in many of our minds. Yet we're really fortunate in recent years to see increased offerings of materials that meet this need at the secondary and post-secondary level. And so ironically, in formulating this chapter, I had chosen to incorporate some of those virtual aspects and connecting memoirs to the strong collection of materials from organizations such as Echoes and Reflections, linking them to testimonies from the USC Shoah Foundation, and encouraging educators to explore using memoirs with the USC Shoah Foundation's Eyewitness platform. And then also making connections to the vast resources of so many excellent museums nationwide, including the ever-growing efforts of our National Museum in Washington. And so ultimately, the chief goal of this chapter was to provide a framework to help educators sort through the myriad of memoirs that are out there. I mean, if you go to Amazon today and just type in Holocaust memoir, it's just incomprehensible at times to see how many there are. And so how do you select that best fit for your teaching situation, and then also utilize them in an affecting and engaging fashion to meet the needs of students in our classrooms today. And fittingly, as you mentioned earlier, tonight would have been the 92nd birthday of Elie Wiesel. And he once said, for the survivor, writing is not a profession, but an occupation, a duty. And I feel that as educators, it's our duty, our responsibility to ensure that we share these firsthand accounts with our students alongside the teaching of content and context. For it's in these stories that the voices of the past are going to truly live and resonate with our students forever. And so I want to thank both you, Avi, and Laura for the opportunity to work with you and this amazing team of contributors. As a classroom educator and someone that works with students like all of us do, I was so excited to receive this book and see all of the amazing contributions that we can put into practice. And I really appreciate the opportunity. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And it does make me think, as we talk about sort of as Alora started with the challenges of the Claims Conference survey on Holocaust education, that I think we have reason for optimism to know that we have educators who are so passionate and dedicated about this topic, teaching students in our country today. So, you know, that's a counterpoint to these surveys that come out.
I find optimism in the Echoes survey, which shows the difference that we're all making. So
Right. So there is reason for hope, for sure. As you alluded to, the chapter that follows your chapter on memoirs is a chapter on teaching Holocaust literature in the 21st century. And it's a pleasure to introduce Victoria Ahrens, the author of the chapter, who has published more than 70 articles and book chapters, and is the author or editor of A Measure of Memory, Storytelling and Identity in American Jewish Fiction, What Happened to Abraham, Reinventing the Covenant in American Jewish Fiction. I'm going to list some of her publications here. The New Diaspora, The Changing Landscape of American Jewish Fiction, a volume on Bernard Malamud, a Centennial Tribute. There's a lot of publications here, Vicki, so I'm not going to go through all of them. Most recently, Holocaust Graphic Narratives, Generation, Trauma, and Memory. Victoria Ahrens.
Thank you. And I too would like to thank Avi and Laura for inviting me to contribute, but also for I've been teaching literature of the Holocaust for a long time. And what this did was to create an occasion for me to really think about what I do and why I do it, perhaps even more importantly. And so I thought that was I found it very useful. You know, we are approaching a time that will see the end of direct survivor testimony, and thus the transmission and extension of the continuing legacy of the Holocaust becomes increasingly imperative. As third-generation memoirist Daniel Mendelsohn puts it, before it's too late. That is, before forgetting takes the place of memory. Those writing from an ever-increasing temporal and geographical distance from the events of the Holocaust return to narratives of the past in order to bridge the gap, the temporal and affective divide between the diminishing memories of the past and the immediate concerns of the present age, before time and opportunity have eroded such memories. Thus, teaching the literature of the Holocaust to a generation coming of age in the 21st century creates an opportunity, I have found, to re-engage with a new generation of students, the moral and interpretive resonances of this still growing body of literature. And there are, of course, a variety of fruitful ways to structure a course designed to introduce students to the literature of the Holocaust. And I have, over all these years, tried many different ways. But the approach I take now is largely generational. I begin with direct eyewitness accounts, followed by second-generation writers, the children of survivors and others whose own lives and identities were shaped significantly by the legacy of the Holocaust, and then third-generation writers, the generation of the grandchildren, as well as those who write from a third-generational perspective. That is, those writers who have published in the early decades of the 21st century and whose imaginations of events surrounding the Holocaust frame and engender their narratives. The reference to generation then in this context is familial as well as cultural. Taken together, these generations of witnesses create, as psychologist Eva Fogelman posits, a phenomenal intergenerational dialogue. And I attempt to construct through a range of temporalities, geographies, and voices, the breadth of expression and the extension of memory as we move farther in time from the events of the Holocaust. An approach that engages the ongoing evolution in Holocaust literary representation suggests not only the developing genre of Holocaust literature, and as Avi mentioned, my recent book is on, of all things, I mean, I never thought I would end up writing on comics, but on Holocaust graphic narratives. But not only the developing genre of Holocaust literature, but also the extended aftershocks, the way in which the events of the Holocaust, the fact of the Holocaust, casts its tentacles into each subsequent generation. So in brief, my course asks the following question: how does distance, temporal, geographical, experiential, with each passing generation shape our response to the Holocaust? In concert with eyewitness accounts, subsequent generations of post-Holocaust writers carry memory into the future in an attempt to reckon with that history, to articulate the enormity of the Holocaust, and to speak to the imperative of remembering its continuing weight and consequences for our lives. The course I teach thus concludes not with the end of the war and the liberation of the concentration camps, but with the future, with future generations and the continuing legacy of the Holocaust. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vicki, and I'm so happy that you two were able to contribute to this volume. So our next speaker is my wonderful colleague at the University of Connecticut, and I was so pleased that this is something that we were able to collaborate on, and the beginning of many collaborations that we're going to have in this field going into the future. Alan Marcus is an associate professor in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction at the University of Connecticut and is a UConn teaching fellow. His scholarship focuses on museum education and teaching with film, with an emphasis on the Holocaust. He's a faculty fellow for the Holocaust Institute for Teacher Educators at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and co-author of Teaching History with Film, Strategies for Secondary Social Studies in 2018, and co-editor of Teaching Difficult History Through Film. His current research is evaluating the potential and limitations of virtual interactive Holocaust survivor testimony. And his chapter in the volume is The Gray Zone of Holocaust Education, Teaching with Film. Alan.
Thanks, Avi. And again, everyone's thank you and Laura, but I'll just, add, don't want to neglect you. So there's the role of survivors in Holocaust and teaching the Holocaust and Holocaust education has come up several times. So I actually want to start by talking about survivors before I talk about film. For the past 2 weeks, I spent time in my class, which is with pre-service history teachers. And we've spent the past 4 classes thinking about how to teach difficult topics. And so we've done a case study around race for a contemporary difficult topic, and we've done a case study around the Holocaust for a historical difficult topic. And lots of interesting questions come up. We just watched Schindler's List, and one of the questions that students asked me last week and have asked me in the past is, well, how come there are so many Holocaust museums and Holocaust memorials in the US? Because the Holocaust didn't happen here. And you could argue, they would say the US wasn't really very involved in doing anything to prevent the Holocaust. So why do we have all these museums and memorials, and why is it taught so much in the United States? And it's a complicated answer, but one of the things I point to is the role of Holocaust survivors and those who came to the United States. And then I follow by asking them how many of them have heard a Holocaust survivor speak live. And these days it's only a handful, but almost all of them have seen one or more Holocaust films. And so I say that because as we transition from a world where students are not going to be able to hear from a Holocaust survivor live in person, we need to think about not what's going to replace Holocaust survivors, because you can't replace hearing from a survivor, but what's going to fill that void. Are we not going to teach about the Holocaust, or are we going to use other resources? So you've heard just before me people talk about in the other chapters memoirs and literature and other sources, and certainly when I work with my pre-service teachers about how to teach the Holocaust, we talk about lots of different sources that are important. But I'd make the argument that film is particularly well positioned to help fill the void left by the lack of Holocaust survivors that we'll have in the coming year. So I use that to sort of frame what I'm going to say. So the chapter is really divided into two sections. It's supposed to be a resource for those teaching at the university level, but it's really aimed at high school teachers and pre-service teachers and what they can do with film. So the first part of the chapter lays out sort of a rationale and a model for how do we think about using film to teach the Holocaust. So one of the big areas of emphasis is using film to develop empathy, which I think is an important role that Holocaust survivors have played. We also look at using film to develop connections between the past and the present, to bring the past alive in a way that other sources may not be able to do, and to provide alternate perspectives that we might not get from many other sources. I go on to talk about what I think are some important issues in thinking about teaching the Holocaust and this difficult topic with film. So thinking about what makes the Holocaust difficult to teach as a topic, thinking about the graphic content that we find in film and what might be appropriate and what might not be. Thinking about how to choose which films to use. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of films, and the chapters at the list has an end of ones that we might recommend. One of which, by the way, is not The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, which I do not recommend. And then thinking about film as a form of historical evidence. Again, with the Holocaust as an example. The chapter then presents two cases of actual teachers teaching the Holocaust with film, and one of them focuses on Europa Europa, Amen, and the Counterfeiters, to think about using non-American films to teach about the Holocaust, to bring in a different perspective than you might not get elsewhere. And the second chapter is focused on developing empathy and thinking about the different roles people play, and uses Schindler's List, The Gray Zone, and Defiance. So I don't want to get into the details of the cases here. I think that'll get us bogged down, but the essence of the chapter is sort of a theoretical framework for why we should be using film to teach history, and then two practical case studies with lots of ideas that teachers can use.
Thank you so much, Alan. And again, this is such an incredibly useful chapter because film is such a popular way for teachers to teach the topic, and you really go through and have them think critically about how they make the choices, what works, what doesn't work, and why not to use The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, which I'm glad you included in your remarks this evening. I'll just make note, we have 4 chapters left that we're going through, and we're really so incredibly lucky to have 16 of our 20 contributors here. If you do have questions that you want to make sure get answered, feel free to type them into the Q&A, because I think we'll have limited time for Q&A at the end of our program. So please feel free to type them in, and we'll try to answer them as we go through the program. So Margaret Myers-Feinstein unfortunately was not able to join us this evening, but she's the author of a chapter on survivor testimonies and interviews. Again, a really important, crucial source that is used think about the over 50,000 testimonies collected by the Shoah Foundation, the testimonies collected by the Fortunoff Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies at Yale, the testimonies collected by the Holocaust Museum, and many more that are available online. And she goes through and has educators think critically about how to make the best use of these sources. The next chapter in the volume is authored by Valerie Hebert. And Valerie, I'm going to share the PowerPoint because this is a chapter that deals with teaching with photographs. Valerie is an associate professor of history and interdisciplinary studies at Lakehead University in Orillia, Ontario, Canada, offering courses on European history, the Holocaust, and the photography of human rights violations and international conflict. She has received research fellowships from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, Hebrew University, and the Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the USHMM. She's published on the Nuremberg trials, Rwanda's Gacaca tribunals, and the Holocaust's influence on human rights discourse. Currently, she's writing about photographs documenting mass shootings of Jewish women and children in Eastern Europe during World War II. Valerie.
Thank you very much, Avi. And I can just only echo what all the other contributors have said, that it was an absolute pleasure, an honor to be invited to be part of the project, a pleasure to work with you as editors. So thank you again. So the focus of my chapter is Holocaust photographs. My aim with it was to communicate the advantages and challenges of using photographs as sources. I begin by outlining the qualities and characteristics that are particular to the photographic medium. So for example, they're incredibly precise. They capture a moment in time, and in freezing that moment of time, open it to scrutiny. Right? We can spend a long time with a still photograph. They're incredibly specific. They individualize experience. They literally give faces to events. I tried to outline the kinds of photographs that are Holocaust photographs that exist and the general conditions of their creation. I describe a few well-known photographers, a few well-known series. Again, all this with a view to an educator who might be new to this material. I tried to offer some practical, applicable tools for reading a photograph, a method that could be applied in leading students through an exercise with photographs, or even a scholar who's using photographs in their own research. So things like looking for the clues in the images that tell us whether they were taken openly or whether they were taken in secret, paying attention to focal point, but then also being aware that we are not locked into the photographer's perspective, that we can move around the frame in ways that they may not have intended or even themselves noticed. It's, you know, we notice the composition, we look at the subjects, were they posed? Was there, can we deduce some interaction between the photographer and the subject? Was there eye contact? Did the photographer want their subject's attention? These kinds of things. I also address what can be done with the more frustrating photographs, and there are many of these in the visual record of the Holocaust, photographs that have no caption, that are anonymous. We don't know who the photographer was, we don't necessarily know the place or the date when the image was captured. And my training is as a historian, and this is the kind of source that would be really difficult to use because, you know, we anchor our interpretation in the factual specificity of our sources. And so in studying photographs and in writing this chapter, I wanted to convey that there's still quite a lot we can do with these sources, as baffling as they might be. And I lead readers through an examination of one photograph. It's not the one that's shown here, to show that our given the cues and just what we're seeing in the frame, this can lead us into numerous interpretations, all of which are instructive, right? They're still rooted in a certain context about which we know a lot, which we're not just saying anything about these images, but we can make fairly reasoned conclusions about what we're looking at. And even if those conclusions move in different directions, they're still valuable. I also discussed the morally troublesome perpetrator photographs. I try to remind readers that although they were initially taken to humiliate or to celebrate, they can be read also as an indictment of that very cruelty. Photographs of atrocity are their own opposite. A trophy photograph is also evidence of crime. The photographer's image subverts its own motivation. I engage some of the thorny ethical issues that attach to photographs. Again, looking at photographs that on their surface seem quite clear, but in fact are much more ambiguous in their meaning. So the photograph you're all seeing now was taken by Henrik Ross. He was a prisoner of the Łódź Ghetto who also took photographs. You look at this image, and what we see is love and affection between members of a family. We see new life in the baby. But when we understand a little more about the subject that was captured, and maybe the initiated would recognize the uniform the man is wearing, we come to learn that this is a photograph of a Warsaw Ghetto policeman, Łódź Ghetto policeman and his family. And this changes perhaps how we view what it is that we're seeing, because the ghetto police served at times to enforce Nazi demands for collection and deportation, and for doing this work reaped certain benefits, protection, first of all. And so we look at this image and we see simultaneously both love and affection, but also betrayal and moral corruption. And I use this photograph and describe it as the visual counterpart to The Gray Zone, that wonderful essay by Primo Levi, heart-wrenching essay in which he brings us to the very heart of Nazi depravity that intertwined good and evil, that implicated victims in their own persecution. And so I argue that a photograph like this, which is a tangle of opposites, brings us closer to the heart of uneasy truths about the Holocaust. Maybe we can go to the next photograph, Avi. Here's another one of those images that is a complex one to deal with. The photographer in this case was Heinrich Just. He was German, stationed in Warsaw. He was a hotel keeper in his non-wartime life, and on his birthday, in fact, in September 1941, he wandered around the ghetto taking photographs. And it was the privilege of his uniform that allowed him to go wherever he wanted. And he captured in unflinching detail the suffering that he encountered. And he seemed to do this without shame. I mean, he's an ambiguous figure, but in any case, we know from the photographs themselves, he got up very close to the people he captured on camera. And you can see that this is an example. He held the gaze of his subject, and he is staring, and through his photographs, he allows us to stare. He's a complex figure, and I think he's revealing of the sort of complex ideas and issues that go along with photographs, because although the photographer was, I think the best thing we can say about him, flimsy in his ethics, it's still because of his intrusiveness, because of his willingness to stare and to capture these people on film, that we have some of the most valuable, incomparable images of the Warsaw Ghetto experience. And so what I hope people take away is an expanded appreciation for the richness and complexity of Holocaust photographs, and a capacity to bring that sensitivity to photographs, historical photographs and photographs that document our current crises. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Valerie, and thank you for sharing these insights into photography and getting us to think 2 or 3 times about photographs that many of us have seen multiple times, but maybe don't look at as critically as we should. So thank you so much. By the way, there are questions that are coming in the Q&A, and anyone, of the panelists, if you feel that you want to answer them, feel free to jump in to respond to the questions. The next chapter, it deals with teaching the Holocaust in museums. And as you'll note, many of the contributors to this volume have a connection to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in one way or another. And museums, as we know, are an incredible resource for the teaching of the Holocaust, but I was especially grateful that we were able to recruit our next chapter contributor for this chapter on museums. Daniel Green is president and librarian at the Newberry Library in Chicago and an adjunct professor of history at Northwestern University. He curated Americans and the Holocaust, a special exhibition that opened at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. in 2018. His book, The Jewish Origins of Cultural Pluralism, published in 2011, won the Saul Wiener Book Prize in American Jewish History. Danny.
Thanks, Avi, and thanks, Laura, for inviting me to contribute to the volume. It's an honor to be included. I had this opportunity to write the chapter on teaching the Holocaust in museums, and while some of what I say might sound basic today, a lot of it is based on close work with teachers in the museum space. I think that entering a Holocaust museum can be a profoundly overwhelming experience for students that leave them with new understandings of the narrative and the significance of Holocaust history, but they need to be well prepared for that. So I structure the chapter around 8 questions that are intended to help teachers and students as they prepare for a museum visit. And some of them are quite, or some of them draw on my experience as a staff member at the Holocaust Memorial Museum, but I think they're applicable to Holocaust museums across the United States and indeed across the world. I'll just talk about a few things briefly in the interest of time, but one is that I think it's crucial to help students understand that museums are not neutral arbiters of historical content. Exhibitions are the result of careful consideration, debate, reasoned judgment by curators and by other museum staff. So students should be encouraged to recognize these choices and discuss these choices. And I think that's a challenge for students sometimes, to walk into a museum and not realize there were other ways to tell this story, but the story is told in an exhibition in this particular way because of the result of choices that curators and educators and historians and others have made. And then if you can help students recognize that, you can move beyond questions like, did you like this exhibition? And ask questions like, why do you think the museum chose to present the topic in this way? And really surface choices in storytelling. So as I said, the chapter is based on 8 questions that I think apply to exhibitions that are about the Holocaust or historical exhibitions more generally, about how the exhibition is organized, where it begins, where it ends, how it incorporates media. I'll just focus on one question that I ask, which is about iconic artifacts. Are there iconic artifacts in the exhibition? What are they? How are they displayed? This is, of course, one of the most exciting opportunities of going to a museum, is seeing the objects of history and the artifacts of history. And I think I try to explain that educators can encourage students to look closely at these objects, and that introductory questions are not too basic. What is this? Who did this belong to? How was it used? How is an object connected to an individual's life? In thinking about the role of the artifacts in exhibitions, I think students will benefit from that kind of prompting. And especially then as we think about some of the iconic artifacts that we see in so many Holocaust related exhibitions, whether something as large as a train car or something as intimate as a yellow star or a pair of shoes or a teddy bear, for example. So the exhibition the chapter is structured around those questions. And then I ask some questions at the end of the chapter about the future of Holocaust museums. We've talked already, other presenters have talked about, we're at a moment where we're at the end of living witnesses to this event. That's going to change the museum experience. Even as recorded testimony endures, or even as we've seen some museums experiment with holographic technology, still the opportunity to speak one-on-one with a survivor in a space like a Holocaust museum will soon be lost. And I raise questions about how that will influence the future of Holocaust museums. And then a very difficult question, I think, for students to chew on about the relationship between telling the history of the Holocaust and telling the history of other genocides within Holocaust museums. Again, difficult to predict the future, but certainly a critically important question for these institutions as they go forward. So I'll leave it there and just say thanks again to Avi and Laura for including me.
Thank you so much, Danny, and thank you for raising these critical questions. A question for you before we continue. So you're the curator of Americans in the Holocaust, which is really an incredible exhibit, which was created for the 25th anniversary of the museum and is quite timely and, as I've told you many times, so well done. For those who have not seen the exhibit, do you know how long the plan is to keep it open at the museum in Washington?
Well, I think plans during the pandemic are now incredibly difficult. The exhibition was intended to be up through the fall of 2021. Right now, the Holocaust Museum remains closed, although I know there are plans to try to reopen it soon in a way that prioritizes visitors' safety. We've also, there's an online version of the exhibition that was a great collaboration across staff at the museum, and there will soon be a traveling version of the exhibition in conjunction with the American Library Association that's going to go to 50 libraries across the country. But again, the launch of that traveling exhibition has been delayed because of the pandemic.
Okay, well, hopefully we'll be able to get back to the museum in person soon.
I hope so.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So our next chapter deals with sort of a perfect segue from museums, which looks at memorials, monuments, and the obligation of memory. And the author of this chapter is Stuart Abrams. Stu Abrams teaches genocide studies, psychology, history, and human rights education at Avon High School, just down the road from me here in Avon, Connecticut. He's the recipient of numerous awards, including the Joseph Korzenick Fellowship for Excellence in Holocaust Education from the Greenberg Center at the University of Hartford. He was a museum teacher fellow from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in 2000. He was the Avon District Teacher of the Year in 2009-2010. He was recipient of the inaugural Simon Conover Award in recognition for excellence in Holocaust teaching in 2016. And he serves as part of the organizing committee of the annual University of Hartford Holocaust Educators Conference for middle school and high school teachers. He also serves as an organizer at the Belfer Next Step Conference for the Northeast region in 2017. So it is a pleasure to welcome Stu Abrams. I'm going to unmute you, Stu.
Yeah,
You're unmuted now.
Been a long day. I too wanted to thank Avi and Laura for extending this really unexpected opportunity and honor for me to contribute to this astonishing project. I never could have imagined how this would ultimately have turned out, and yet I am humbled by the addition this text makes to the literature of Holocaust and genocide education. Avi, if you could move to the next. It should be brought to mind that we build monuments to remember the histories we must not forget. Memorials must never distract us from our true history. When I began my chapter, I never considered or imagined that the possibility existed for monuments or their removal, not only in the United States, but around the world, would or could become such a flashpoint relative to civil discourse. It reminds us that memorials reflect not only a person, a place, or an event, but rather monuments are also reflective of our values. It is good to remember that, at least for most of us on this Zoom, that we are Americans and what American values are, especially now. We mustn't put our heroes on pedestals simply to remember them. We raise them up because we want to emulate their virtues. This is how we can honor them. Next slide, Avi, please. So the statement above is really the thesis for my chapter, and also when I do a unit in my classroom, this is really the focus, the thread that runs through the entire unit. But the challenge for these creative virtuosos is to provide viewers with the opportunity to become active, not passive, rememberers of the past. Their works of art are not just stone and metal. They are not just innocent remembrances of a benign history. These monuments must never purposefully celebrate a fictional, sanitized history by ignoring the death, ignoring the enslavement, ignoring the terror that the Holocaust actually stood for. These monuments must empower our students and us to be accountable and responsible for their memory of the Shoah. Last slide, Avi. So my final slide is a shameless plug for the value of travel. Visiting memorials in person is an indescribably powerful experience. Consider your students pondering a monument like this one from the perspective of, let's say, a perpetrator, a victim, a bystander, a liberator, a rescuer. And with rescuers, I often ask the question, is courage more easily fantasized than realized? And when you're working with 15, 16, 17-year-old students, they generally go, oh, yeah, I would help, I would. But it's a very difficult thing to really put your finger on. So can you do it? Can you help your students see that perspective? Can we help them? Can we convince our students that this monument is there to encourage? Will our students feel inspired and hopeful by the story of Korczak? Do monuments help our students see a future with limitless potential? When our students are confronted with Treblinka, will the searing truth of the Holocaust come into focus for them? If anything, memorials and monuments must teach us that we cannot and must never walk away from the truth. Last comment, I just wanted to dovetail a little bit on what Jen said, and Avi also added to, is this notion of hope. When I think of my students, since I started teaching, it was around Lincoln's second inaugural, I see them as messengers to a time that I shall not see. And I am very comfortable leaving in their hands the future of this education and the message that this education, how it impacts students. I am unabashedly hopeful that the future will be better because of these young 21st century young adults and what they will contribute to the world moving forward. So thanks again, Avi and Laura, and it's really an honor to be with such a terrific, amazing group of contributors. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stu. And I'm just stopping the screen share. I'm so glad that you were able to contribute to this volume. And I think if you can tell us about what Lincoln's inaugural was like, that would be amazing for you to be able to share. And
it'll be a little too much time, but it was nothing like last night. I can promise you that.
Right. Well done. And I appreciate your optimism that we will be able to be traveling with our students again quite soon. So our last speaker, and really last but not least, and really the last chapter in the volume, which pulls it all together in a sense and focuses on why should we teach the Holocaust today and tomorrow, which is essentially could have been the first chapter in the volume, making the case for why it is so important to engage in this teaching and why this subject matter, why this volume is so important to come out now, is authored by Robert Hadley. Rob Hadley works as a teacher trainer in Bethel, Alaska, helping prepare native Yupik students for a career in teaching. He worked as a consultant with the USC Shoah Foundation, training teachers on integrating testimony into their curriculum after teaching history and Holocaust studies for 20 years near Portland, Oregon. He was a USHMM Fellow in 2001, as well as the Holocaust Educators Network Fellow with the Olga Lengyel Institute. He currently co-directs the annual Oregon Holocaust Seminar. He holds master's degrees in secondary education from Western Oregon University and one in Holocaust and Genocide Studies from Gratz College. Robert Hadley.
Thank you, and I want to thank all the Zoom warriors who've stuck with us all the way to the end. I appreciate your being here tonight and sharing with us the volumes that we put together for this study. When I start off this question, why should we teach the Holocaust today and tomorrow? It emanated from the study that I finished up my work at Gratz College. And little did I know that the 20 preceding chapters that come before this particular chapter have done such an eloquent job of leading us to an answer as to why this is such a significant history to study. So thank you for that. You made my job easier and harder all at the same time. So I appreciate that. I think for me, I want to highlight my main goal in this conversation is especially focusing on secondary education and what educators are doing with Holocaust education, and really focusing teachers on why. What's the rationale? What's the reason for why you're teaching this subject to your students, and how you integrate that into your curriculum? Because understand this is being taught in many different curriculums throughout school, whether that be in language arts, social studies, it could be taught in art, in music, science. It's taught in so many different ways. The big conversation piece is why are you doing this, and to what is your goal that you're trying to approach in teaching this history? I think when I do a lot of work with teachers, I realize that over 65% of my teachers in my trainings over the years have been language arts teachers. They're not instructing this material with the focus of historical information in mind. So when I look at that claims conference report that Laura talked about at the beginning, that students are walking away not knowing certain pieces of information, it's because the rationales of what teachers were doing in those classrooms really weren't focused on that as a goal of an outcome for students to learn. So I talk a lot about rationale and working with teachers in that respect. But I also turn then towards the question of really going towards teacher training. You've seen over the last couple of years, students really, states really turning towards mandates. Something else I talk about in this chapter, requiring Holocaust education, which is important. The work that we've seen done. Matter of fact, one of them happened in the state of Oregon, where I'm from. We're a 14-year-old girl who connected with a Holocaust survivor, a good friend of mine, Al Wiener, and worked to change the law in the state of Oregon to mandate Holocaust education, something I'd worked on for 20 years, and it took a 14-year-old girl to make happen, which is awesome. But it then turns back to the question, not that it's being taught, but that it's being taught well. So we must pivot from talking about mandating and teaching the Holocaust, and we've answered the question, and really help our teachers to effectively teach this to our students. From the other study that we talked about earlier as well, the Echoes and Reflection study, we heard about the effectiveness of quality Holocaust education when done well with their students. And so to me, I think that's really one of the big takeaways is when it's done well, what does that look like? And I think the other question I kept pondering as well is, what is the big takeaway down the line? This might ruffle some feathers, especially among my historian friends here, because we're so invested in this. We kind of are in a bubble in education, in Holocaust education, we're a small circle. But as we mandate this to a wider audience of teachers who may not be so vested in this history, I think one of my big concerns is that it's not going to be taught with fidelity. So I think that's why this volume is so critical to me, is that we can help teachers to get the professional development they need to do the best we can with this material. But I looked at that claims conference report, and I questioned not knowing about Auschwitz or not knowing a particular camp's name. And then I asked a survivor friend of mine, it's like, what do you hope students take away from this history 25 years from now, when there are no survivors left? And I think to me that their answer back was nothing to do with what the claims conference study was really getting at. It was really about those deeper impacts on student behavior and their life behaviors moving forward. That deep empathy we talked about, that we really want as a takeaway from teaching Holocaust education well. And so to me, I think that's one of the big takeaways I think I walked away from is why are we teaching this today? But also why are we teaching this tomorrow? And why do we continue teaching this down the line? We're now 80 years out from the beginning of the Holocaust, almost 80 years out. And this generation, my daughter is now junior in high school. How will she make meaning of this event? We have to accept the reality, and Stuart just talked about this, that they will make that meaning down the line through memorialization, through the curriculum that they're taught in their classroom, but also most importantly, how they live their lives. Based on having learned this information, what do we do with it? When I taught this class, I taught a Holocaust and Genocide Studies class for years. I always told my students, I'm teaching two of you at the same time. I'm teaching you here in the room right now, but I'm also teaching you 5 years down the line. When you finally click with some of the information that's coming at you, because we need that life experience to connect with what's coming at you. And I say that, and literally yesterday, a student of mine sent me an email on Facebook who I hadn't talked to in 5+ years, and almost on a time, and told me how much it impacted him and how much it's impacting him now in the current climate we're living in. So it was like another reminder about why I do what I do. So I thank you again for giving us this opportunity to share and talk a little bit about Holocaust education. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rob. And I really think it's sort of a perfect way to kind of wrap up this evening's program and this webinar, thinking about the importance of teaching today. And as you suggested that you're teaching, yeah, thank you for holding up a copy of the book, teaching for today and teaching for the students of tomorrow. And as you suggested, we're at this crucial moment, 75 years after the end of the war, where we see the last living eyewitnesses to World War II, to the Holocaust, passing away in increasing numbers. And we know that those who would deny this history know that they have time on their side, right? And so the importance of providing facts, providing resources like this, not only that it must be taught, but that it must be taught well, is incredibly important. So I, for one, am so grateful to all the contributors to this volume, to all of you for sharing your time and expertise, to all of you for joining us this evening. And as Rob suggested, to all the Zoom warriors out there who stayed with us throughout this program. Really, thank you for your time and your attention. Thank you for the questions that you have been asking over the course of the evening. I see that there are other questions that are coming in as we go through from people who are excited to use the book. And what I think I'll do is we'll save these questions, and I'm going to direct them to those of you and put you in email contact with the questioners in the interest of time here at the end of a long evening. So I want to thank you all for being here this evening. Thank you to Laura, my co-editor, for inviting me to join you on this project. And again, please order the book, use it in your teaching, and thank you all for joining us here this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you again.
Stay safe, everybody. Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah.
Be well.
Thank you very much.